Has 46, my son, left me without goodbye, so I kept his place in my heart forever. This is my true story. I never imagined the day would come when my own son would leave me without a word. All my life, I worked for him, built a home for him, and gave him every dream I could not live. But one morning I realized he was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence. I was left with a quiet house and a heavy heart. I learned that absence can hurt deeper than words. Before I share what I did next, tell me where you are watching from right now, and please subscribe so more people can hear my story. I spent my life for my son. From the first day I held him, I knew my duty was to give him everything I could. I worked every day, from morning till night, with aching bones and tired hands. I faced hunger, storms, illness, and cold winters without complaint. I gave up comforts I deserved so he could have warmth. I gave up rest so he could sleep peacefully. Every coin I earned was saved for him. Every hardship I endured was for his tomorrow. I dreamed that one day he would stand with pride, wearing the fruits of my hard work. I imagined his voice saying thank you, his eyes full of love and respect. I believed that sacrifices build respect. I believed that the love between a father and son is stronger than time. I believed that my son would never leave without a word. I believed he would hold my hand when I was old. I believed he would sit beside me in my quiet days and tell me my life was worth it. I believed he would carry my name with honor. Every scar on my hands, every ache in my body, every sleepless night, all of it was for him. I believed that my sacrifice was his inheritance, not just property or money, but a life built with love. I thought my son understood this without words. I thought he knew I gave him my best because I wanted him to live better than I did. I thought my devotion was enough. But life teaches you in silence that devotion is not always returned. My son did not grow up seeing my tears, but he saw my work. He saw the sweat and struggle. He saw me leaving home before the sun and returning when the stars were bright. He saw me tired and broken, yet working. He knew I gave him everything, and I believed he carried it in his heart. I thought my labor was proof enough. But devotion is a silent language. You expect it to be understood without explanation. I believed that my son's heart would one day speak the same language without me saying it. I thought that the years of sacrifice would create a bond stronger than any trial. I thought love was enough to hold us together. I thought that my son would never leave me without a goodbye. But devotion is tested and silence is misunderstood. I learned that devotion without acknowledgement is an empty gift. I learned that giving without recognition can break the giver quietly. My devotion became my pain, and my pain became my question. Did he not see my years? Did he not feel my sacrifices? Did he not understand that my life was built for him? My heart wanted to ask, but my voice grew weak with hope. I waited for him to speak, to come to me, to say that he knew, but the silence was louder than any word he could give. I kept building for him, even when I felt the cracks in our relationship growing. I kept giving, even when he stopped listening. I kept working, even when my body ached. Because a father's devotion is not measured by return, but by persistence. I believed persistence was enough. I believed that love does not demand recognition. But I was wrong. I was wrong to think that my son would understand without telling him. I was wrong to think that devotion alone could hold us together. The house I built for him became a silent witness to my sacrifices. Every brick, every nail, every board was placed with his future in mind. I worked in silence so he could speak freely. I labored without rest so he could rest easy. I gave without asking for thanks so he could live without debt. My devotion was a language of unspoken love, but my silence became my son's misunderstanding. I believed that my actions were louder than any words, but my silence was misunderstood as weakness, and my devotion was taken for granted. I gave him my life without asking for a moment of recognition. I gave him my dreams without asking for a share of his own. I gave him my strength without asking for help in return. I believed that this was what a father must do, I believed that love is silent. I believed that devotion never ends. I believed that my son would never leave without saying goodbye. But one morning, I woke to find my belief shattered. The day my son left without a word is a day I cannot forget. I had built my life for him, and he walked away without a glance back. No goodbye. No acknowledgement of what was given. No respect for what was built. Just silence. That silence was louder than any betrayal I could imagine. It was a silence that cut deeper than words, deeper than blows. That silence was a wound I could not heal. That silence became my grief. I kept asking myself why. Why did he leave without speaking? Why did he not answer my calls? Why did he not even send a message? I had given everything, yet I was left with nothing but silence. I could not understand how devotion could be returned with abandonment. How could a bond built over decades be broken without a word? My heart broke not for the loss of my son, but for the loss of recognition for my life's work. I realized then that devotion is fragile. It can be ignored. It can be taken for granted. It can be broken by silence. And when silence becomes the answer, there is no return. I learned that a father's devotion is not always enough. I learned that love without acknowledgement can turn into sorrow. I learned that leaving without goodbye is one of the deepest wounds a father can bear. But I also learned something else, that devotion leaves a mark, even when it is unanswered. My devotion became my strength. My devotion became my decision. My devotion became the voice I had lost. I realized that my silence could speak louder than any plea, and I decided that my answer to his leaving would not be in words, but in keeping his place in my heart forever. That is what I decided, to hold him in my heart, without anger, without bitterness, without regret, to let my silence speak for me, to let my heart carry the weight of love even when my voice could not. Because devotion is not about being answered. Devotion is about loving without condition. And even when my son left without goodbye, I kept his place in my heart forever. At first, I did not notice it clearly. The distance between a father and a son can begin so quietly, like the slow fading of light at dusk. At first, it was small things, a missed call, delayed reply. I thought he was busy, that life was pulling him in another direction. I told myself it was nothing, that my son still cared in his own way. But the signs grew. They became louder, sharper, undeniable. The visits became fewer. At first, once a week, then once a month, and then they stopped altogether. Invitations to family dinners went unanswered. Birthdays passed without a visit or a call. I sent messages, simple ones, asking how he was, if he was well, if he needed anything, but they were left unanswered. My heart felt a slow ache each time my phone remained silent. The silence spoke more than words could. It told me my son was choosing distance. I watched him from a distance too. I heard from others that he was doing fine, that life was good for him. Yet he never made the effort to come to me. He never spoke of home. He never spoke of me. It was as though I had become a stranger to him. The son I had carried, protected, and raised with endless love was becoming someone I could no longer reach. It was the quietest form of pain, being forgotten by your own child. It began in small ways. He no longer asked about my health. He no longer asked about my days. He no longer sought advice. His visits stopped being accompanied by laughter, by conversation, by warmth. They became empty, and then they stopped altogether. I remember the moment when I realized it was not just distance in space, but distance in heart. He was drifting away from me without saying why. The missed phone calls were the loudest part. Each ring unanswered felt like a small blade cutting into my heart. I would see his name appear on the screen and feel a wave of hope, thinking maybe this time he would call back. But it would end in silence again. I began to wait for his call every evening, but the phone remained quiet. I would sit in my chair, staring at the ringing phone that never rang. My own home became a place of echoes. I tried to speak to him once, softly, with care. I asked him why he was avoiding me. His reply was brief, colder than I expected. He said he was busy. But the word busy became a wall between us. A word that stopped conversation, stopped connection. I could feel my son closing his heart to me. I could feel the warmth of his presence disappearing. And still, I hoped it was temporary. I told myself time would heal the silence. But time did not heal it. It only deepened it. Weeks turned into months. Every unanswered call became another layer of distance. Every ignored invitation became another crack in the bridge between us. I began to hear from neighbors and friends that my son was choosing not to come, that my place in his life was fading. I tried to reach him through letters, small gifts, anything that could remind him of my devotion. Yet each attempt was met with silence. I began to notice the way he avoided my gaze when we did meet briefly. His smiles no longer reached his eyes. His voice was shorter, sharper. He spoke to me when spoken to, but never offered more. It was as though the bond between us was quietly unraveling, thread by thread. I felt my role as a father slipping away. The closeness we once shared was gone, replaced by something colder, something I could not name. I wondered where I had gone wrong. I asked myself if there was a moment when his heart turned away from mine. I replayed every memory of his childhood, every sacrifice, every word of advice I had given him. Was it enough? Had I missed something? My mind searched for answers, but silence kept returning. Silence was the sign, the proof, the answer. My son was walking away, and he was doing it quietly, without telling me why. I began to feel the emptiness growing between us. It was not just the lack of visits or calls. It was the loss of presence, the absence of shared moments. No laughter, no conversations, no warmth. Just absence. The kind of absence that feels heavier than loss because there is no closure. Only the slow ache of distance that never ends. I kept hoping he would return, that he would explain, that he would reach out. But every day brought the same quiet truth. He was choosing not to answer me. He was choosing not to listen to my tears. And that choice was becoming a wound I could not heal. I realized then that distance is not just about space, it is about connection. And my connection with my son was breaking. The silence between us was not empty. It was full of everything we had lost, full of years of devotion ignored, full of sacrifices unseen, full of a father's heartbreak. And so I sat quietly with the truth. I did not call him again. I stopped sending messages. I stopped waiting by the phone. I let the silence grow, not because I gave up, but because I had learned that silence can speak louder than words. And in that silence, I began to prepare my heart for what was to come. I waited. I waited for a day I knew would come, but did not know when. A day when my son would stand at my door, look at me, and speak. A day when he would tell me why he was leaving, or at least say goodbye. But that day never came. I waited with hope that grew heavy with time, and that hope became pain. Pain that settled deep in my chest, a weight I carried in silence. The morning began quietly, as it often did. I woke with the sound of the wind outside, the sunlight soft on the floor. I made tea slowly, keeping my hand steady, though my heart was restless. I thought maybe today would be the day my son came home. I thought maybe today I would hear his voice, feel his hand on my shoulder, see his face in the light. But the hours passed, and there was no knock at the door. I tried to call him again. I thought if I heard his voice, even briefly, it would ease the ache inside me. I pressed his number carefully, as if the way I pressed it could matter. My finger hesitated. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I pressed call. The phone rang and rang. No answer. My heart sank with each tone. I sat back in my chair, staring at the quiet phone. The silence grew louder. Days became weeks. I kept waiting for him. Every day, I woke with a hope that today might be different. I dressed, walked to the garden, and watched the birds. I thought of calling him again, but I stopped myself. What would I say? How could I speak words that might not be heard? And so, I waited, alone, in silence. My hope became patience, and my patience became heartbreak. Neighbors began to notice. They asked softly if I had heard from my son. I smiled weakly, told them I had not. I could not tell them how much I waited, how much it hurt. It was not just the absence of his presence, but the absence of an ending. No goodbye, no explanation, no sign that he would ever return. It was as if he had erased me from his world without a thought. I remembered the years we shared, the laughter at the table, the lessons taught softly at night, the days I spent working so he would have what I never had. And now, all that felt distant, all that felt gone. The day of goodbye had passed without a word. The silence between us had become permanent. I was left with a quiet home and a quieter heart. I tried to imagine why he left without saying goodbye. Was it anger? Was it shame? Was it that he thought he was sparing me pain? I could not know. There was no way to ask. My calls went unanswered, my messages unread. The door of my home stayed closed to him, and I was left to sit with the question that had no answer. The day turned into night. I sat in the same chair I had waited in for weeks, my eyes fixed on the door. I thought of him leaving quietly, stepping out into the world without turning back. The thought cut me deeper than any word could, because goodbye is not just a word. It is closure, and without it, there is no peace, only an echo of absence that never fades. I thought of calling him one last time that evening, but I did not. I could not break the silence that had grown between us. I thought that perhaps silence itself would speak to him, that it would carry the weight of all the days I had waited, that it would tell him that his absence had been noticed, that his leaving without goodbye was not something that would be forgotten. Instead, I kept quiet. I kept waiting, not for him to return, but for the truth to be clear to both of us. The truth that his leaving was a choice. The truth that he had closed the door without turning to speak. That was his goodbye. A silent, unspoken goodbye that cut deeper than any words ever could. And in that silence, I began to prepare my heart for what was to come. I began to understand that some goodbyes are not given. They are taken. And some wounds are not healed by words. They are healed by the choice to hold on or to let go. I chose to hold on to him in my heart, even if he had walked away without a word. So I sat quietly in my home. I let the days pass. I let the door stand closed. I let the silence speak for me. And in that silence, I found my answer. Not in his voice, not in his return, but in the quiet strength of a father who had loved without condition. Because some goodbyes are never spoken, they are felt, they are lived, and sometimes they are kept quietly in the heart forever. The house became quieter after that day, not because the world had grown silent, but because my heart had grown quiet. The silence inside me was heavier than any sound. It was not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of grief. A grief that settled slowly, quietly, and deeply. It was a grief born of absence, of love left unanswered, of a door closed without farewell. I sat each morning in my chair by the window, staring at the light outside, listening to the world move on without him. The first days were hardest. I kept waiting. I kept thinking he would come back, perhaps after a day, perhaps after a week. Perhaps he was simply busy, tired, needing time. But the days passed, the weeks passed, and I learned that waiting was a form of pain I had never known. A pain that grows with each unanswered call, each unopened message, each day without a knock at the door. The silence became louder than any noise. I remember one morning in particular. The air was soft, the sun was warm, but I felt cold inside. I woke early, as I always did, and brewed tea quietly. I sat at the table with my cup in hand, my eyes fixed on the door. I thought of him again, of how he had left without a word, of how no one had prepared me for such a goodbye. I thought of the years we had lived together, the struggles we had faced, the sacrifices I had made, and I felt grief, deep, aching grief that words could not describe. Grief is not just sadness. Grief is a quiet breaking. It is a stillness that fills the heart when someone you love is gone and you do not understand why. It is the absence of their voice, their touch, their presence. For me, grief became a companion, a constant shadow. I carried it in silence. I let it settle in my bones. I let it grow until it became part of who I was. I walked the rooms of my home slowly. Each step echoed in the quiet. Each corner held memories. I touched objects softly, as if they might speak to me. My son's coat still hung by the door. His chair still sat at the table. His coffee cup still rested where he had left it. The house had not changed, but everything in it felt different. The air seemed heavier. The walls seemed quieter. My heart seemed emptier. I thought of the last time I saw him, how I had waited for him at the door, how I had imagined him stepping inside, smiling, speaking. But he never came. Not then. Not since. And the pain of that moment stayed with me. It was not just the loss of his presence, but the loss of a goodbye. A father waits for words. A father waits for closure. And I had none. At night, the grief became deeper. The quiet of the house became louder in my mind. I lay in bed, listening to the sound of my own breathing. I thought of him walking away, of the life we had built together, of all the things left unsaid. My grief was not loud. It did not cry out. It was a quiet grief that lived in my chest, a grief that was patient, a grief that would not fade quickly. I began to write quietly in my notebook, not letters for him, but words for myself, words that tried to capture the ache inside, words that tried to give shape to my grief. I wrote about the mornings I waited, about the calls I made, about the silence that answered me. I wrote about the hope that turned into sadness, about the love that stayed even when the person was gone. Writing became a way to speak my grief when no one listened. I found myself walking slowly in the garden. The flowers bloomed and faded. The seasons passed, yet my grief stayed. It did not change with time. It did not leave with spring or summer. It stayed quietly, like a shadow. I walked among the flowers, thinking of the laughter of my son when he was young, thinking of the days we had spent together, thinking of what could have been. My grief was a garden of memories, growing silently in my heart. People around me began to notice. Friends asked why I seemed quieter. Neighbors asked why I no longer smiled. I told them little, because grief is not always spoken. It is felt. They offered advice, saying time would heal me. But I knew that time could not heal this absence. Time could not bring back words that were never said. Time could not return a goodbye that was never given. My grief was not meant to be healed quickly. It was meant to be carried, quietly, patiently, always. Some nights I dreamed of him, not in anger, not in pain, but in memory. I dreamed of him as a boy, running in the garden. I dreamed of him smiling at me. I dreamed of his voice calling my name. But in the morning, the dream would fade. The silence would return, and with it, the grief that never left. I did not speak of this grief to him, not because I forgave, but because there was nothing left to say. My grief was my own. It was not something that could be given away or shared. It was something I carried deep within me, a silent testament to a goodbye that never came. I kept it locked in my heart, like a secret no one could take from me. I began to understand that grief changes a man. It teaches patience. It teaches acceptance. It teaches strength. I was no longer the same man who waited by the door. I had become a man who lived with absence, a man who carried the silence as proof of love. My grief was not an end. It was a transformation. I remembered the years of our life together. I remembered his laughter, his mistakes, his growth. I remembered teaching him to walk, to speak, to dream. I remembered the sacrifices I had made without complaint. And now, in my grief, I remembered too the silence he left behind, the quiet that spoke louder than any word. And so I lived, each day carrying grief quietly, each night letting it rest beside me. I did not stop loving him, even though he had gone without a word. I did not stop keeping him in my heart, even though he had taken his leave without goodbye. My grief became my answer. My grief became my truth. I learned that silence and absence are not emptiness. They are a form of expression. They speak in ways words cannot. My grief was my voice. My grief was my farewell. I did not need him to speak. I had learned to speak in the quiet. And so I kept my silence. Not out of bitterness, not out of defeat, but out of a choice. A choice to carry love without expectation. A choice to honor the place he held in my heart, even if he no longer walked beside me. My grief became my legacy. A legacy of quiet strength, of love without return, of a goodbye that was kept in silence. I know now that some wounds never heal, some losses never fade, some grief never leaves. But I also know that grief can be carried with dignity, that grief can be an act of love. I carry it in my heart every day, a quiet grief that speaks without words, a grief that reminds me of him. My grief became my silence, and my silence became my message, to the world, to my son, and to myself, that even in leaving without goodbye, a place can be kept in the heart forever. Because silence is not absence. Silence is memory. Silence is love. And in that silence, I found peace. In the quiet of my house, after the long days filled with silence, I began to think deeply about love. Not the kind of love that is spoken in words or shown in moments of joy, but the kind of love that lives quietly in the heart even when the other person has gone. Love is not always loud. Love is not always returned. Sometimes love is simply a choice we keep making, even when it brings pain. I thought of all the years I had lived for my son. From the day he was born, I gave him everything I had, my time, my health, my sweat, and my strength. I worked long days and longer nights to give him a life I could not give myself when I was young. I did not rest when he was in need. I did not stop when the weight of the work became heavy. Because love for a child does not stop. It does not weigh the cost. It only acts. But love can be tested. It can be tested by absence, by silence, by cruelty. I learned that the hardest test for a father is to keep loving when the child does not return the same love. I learned that the deepest pain is when love is met with silence, when your tears are ignored, your words unheard, and your heart left alone. My son had tested my love in ways I never imagined. He had taken without giving. He had spoken without listening, and eventually he had left without goodbye. That day, when I realized he would not come back, I sat quietly and thought about what love truly meant. Was love the joy of being together? Or was love something deeper, something that exists even when there is no joy? I came to understand that love is not about receiving. It is not about being noticed. It is about giving without expectation. Love is something you hold in your heart, whether or not it is returned. In my grief, I began to reflect on every moment of my life with him. I remembered holding him as a baby, keeping him safe in my arms. I remembered teaching him to walk, falling beside him each time he stumbled. I remembered the nights I stayed awake when he was sick, not resting until he slept peacefully again. I remembered the years I gave without complaint, believing that one day my sacrifices would be understood, that my love would be returned. But it was not returned, not in the way I had hoped. My son had walked away, not only from me, but from the bond we shared. His refusal to listen to my tears was a wound deeper than any blow. And yet, I still found myself reflecting not with anger, but with a quiet sadness that came from love. I realized then that love and grief are intertwined. They live together. You cannot have one without the other when someone leaves without goodbye. Love is patience. Love is remembering when the other forgets. Love is keeping a place in your heart, even when that person chooses not to be there. I thought of how my heart still held him, still hoped for a return that might never come. I thought of the years of shared memories that could not be erased. Love is memory. Love is keeping what has been given safe, even if it is never returned. I began to see my silence not as a loss of voice, but as an expression of love. I did not need to call him. I did not need to speak to him. My silence became a way of preserving love. By letting go of words, I kept the feeling alive inside me. I knew that my love would not disappear because he turned away. Love lives in quiet moments. Love lives in patience. Love lives in the absence as much as in presence. In those days of reflection, I also thought about forgiveness. Forgiveness is part of love. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting or excusing pain. Forgiveness means freeing your heart from the weight of anger. I began to forgive my son, not for his absence, not for his silence, but for his weakness. For the day when he chose not to say goodbye, not to answer my call. I forgave him quietly in my heart. Forgiveness became part of my reflection on love. Love is not always shown in grand gestures. Sometimes love is shown in quiet endurance. Sometimes it is shown in keeping a place in your heart for someone who will never return. I thought of how my heart was still his home, even though he had left. I thought of how I had chosen not to close that door completely, because love is not a lock. Love is an open space in the heart, and I chose to keep that space open for him. As I reflected, I realized that love is also strength. It is strength to keep living when your heart is broken. It is strength to wake up each day knowing the one you love has gone. It is strength to choose peace instead of bitterness. My love for my son gave me the strength to keep going. My grief gave me the strength to hold on to that love. My silence gave me the strength to speak without words. I thought about what it means to love without receiving. It means giving without expectation. It means keeping faith without proof. It means holding a place for someone even if they do not come. That was the deepest lesson I learned in my reflection on love. That the greatest love is not measured in words or in return, but in the decision to keep giving even when it costs everything. In my heart, I kept my son's place. I did not erase him. I did not turn away completely. I carried him quietly in my heart, as a father carries his child, even when the child is gone. My love became my answer. My reflection became my strength. My grief became my prayer. I began to write these thoughts down, not for him, but for myself, to remind myself of the lessons I had learned, to keep my heart steady in the quiet, to turn grief into understanding. Love, I wrote, is the quiet that remains when words have gone. Love, I wrote, is the place we keep in our hearts forever. And so I decided to live with love as my reflection, not loud, not demanding, not needing to be returned, but as a quiet choice that shaped my days. I decided to keep his place in my heart forever, not as a wish, but as a truth. My silence became an act of love. My grief became an expression of love. My life became a reflection of love itself. Love is what remains when the rest is gone. Love is what teaches us to forgive. Love is what teaches us to keep living. And I learned that the deepest love is the one that stays in silence. Because my son left without goodbye, I chose to let love remain. My silence became my voice. My heart became his home. And my reflection on love became my strength to carry on. When my son left without saying goodbye, the world felt quieter. The house felt emptier. But I knew I could not let his absence erase him from my life. In my heart, I carried him still, not as a living presence, but as a memory. Memory became my way of keeping him alive. Memory became my refuge. Memory became the place where my love stayed even when he was gone. I began to gather those memories quietly. They were not grand moments, but small fragments of our life together. The morning he learned to walk and held my hand for balance. The time I carried him home through the rain when he was too tired to walk. The sound of his laughter when he was a boy and how it filled my heart with joy. Those moments became treasures I could carry with me every day. I found old photographs and letters stored in a small box tucked away in a drawer. Each photo was a window to a moment in time, a reminder of the bond we once shared. I would take them out sometimes and look at them quietly. I could see his face as a child, full of trust and innocence. I could hear his voice in my mind. I could feel again the warmth of his hand in mine. These memories were not gone. They lived in me. The letters were even more precious. Simple words written long ago, full of hope and laughter. Words that spoke of dreams and shared moments. I read them over and over, letting the paper hold his voice for me. They were my proof that love had once been present, that connection had once existed. Even though he had chosen silence now, these memories kept that connection alive. I began to whisper prayers for him every night. I did not pray for him to return. I prayed for his safety, for his peace, for his well-being. My prayers were not loud. They were quiet words spoken in the stillness of the night. They were a way of keeping him close without needing him to be near. My heart had learned to hold him in silence, but my prayers became a way of speaking my love. Every day, I would feel his absence like a physical space beside me, at the table where he once sat, in the room where his laughter once filled the air, in the quiet of the evening when the house no longer had his footsteps. That absence became part of my life, and in a strange way, I came to accept it. I learned that absence itself could be a form of memory. His leaving became part of what I carried with me. I carried his laughter in my heart. I carried the lessons he had learned from me, and the moments we shared that shaped both of us. I carried the dreams we once spoke of, even if they would never come true together. These memories became my silent companions. They gave me comfort when the nights were lonely. They gave me warmth when my heart felt cold. Sometimes I would sit quietly, closing my eyes, and let the memories wash over me. I could almost see him as he was, not the son who left, but the boy I had once held. I could almost hear the sound of his voice calling my name. I could almost feel the touch of his hand. In those moments, memory became a living thing. It was not only the past, it became my present. I began to write those memories down, not to send to him, not to show to anyone else, but to hold them in a form that could last. Writing became a way of carrying him. Each word became a stone I placed in the home of my heart for him. My notes became a small book of our life together, a book I could open whenever the silence grew too loud. Carrying the memory was not easy. It brought both joy and pain. Joy, because I had something precious to hold on to. Pain, because I could not turn back the clock. Pain, because those memories were reminders of what I had lost. But I learned that pain and memory can live together. They can be part of the same quiet love. I kept photographs and letters hidden away, not because I wanted to hide them, but because they were sacred. They were for my heart alone. They were my way of keeping his place safe. Even if he would not answer my calls, even if he would not say goodbye, I chose to keep him, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in quiet love. Each day, I carried my son's memory with me. When I walked through the garden, I remembered how he once ran through it laughing. When I sat by the window, I remembered how he used to stand there, looking out at the world. When I heard the wind at night, I remembered the times we had spoken quietly under the stars. Memory became my way of keeping him near. Even as time passed, I did not let go of those memories. They became part of who I am. They shaped my days. They shaped my silence. My life became an act of carrying what once was, without demanding what could no longer be. Neighbors began to notice my quiet. They asked why I seemed more still. They did not know that I was carrying a great weight, not of anger, but of memory. They did not know that my silence was not emptiness, but a home for him in my heart. I kept my grief quiet, but my memory was alive. Friends told me I should move on. They said I should let go, but I could not. Letting go would mean erasing him, and I had promised myself I would never erase him. I promised to keep his place forever. My silence was not giving up. My silence was keeping the memory safe. I felt his absence deeply, but I also felt the fullness of what he had been to me. He was my son. He was part of my story. And though he had left without goodbye, I could still carry him. My memory became my gift to him, my quiet way of saying that love does not end with absence. I began to see carrying memory as a form of strength. It was not weakness to hold on to the past. It was strength to keep love alive, even when the living person was gone. It was strength to forgive without forgetting. It was strength to hold a place in your heart forever. So I carried his memory every day. I carried it not as a burden, but as a treasure. It was a treasure of time, of love, of all the years I had given without asking for anything in return. My memory was my way of keeping him close, even though he had chosen to leave. I whispered his name sometimes, quietly, in the stillness of the night. Not to call him back, but to remember him, to let my heart speak the truth it held, that I still loved him, that I still carried him, that he had a place in my heart forever. Carrying the memory became my peace. It became my answer. It became my way of living with the silence he left behind. I knew I could not bring him back. I knew I could not change his choice, but I could carry him with me, quietly, in the heart. And so I decided to let memory be my gift to myself, my way of keeping love alive, my way of honoring what once was, my way of telling the world that absence does not erase love, and goodbye is not the end if the heart chooses to remember. My son left without goodbye, but I carried him. I carried him in my heart, and I chose to keep his place there forever. Loss is not a single moment. Loss is a slow change that comes quietly and then grows heavy. It is not the absence of a person alone. It is the absence of the future you imagined with them. It is the absence of the sound of their voice, the sight of their face, the warmth of their presence. When my son left without goodbye, I felt loss in every part of my life. I felt it in the house we lived in together, in the empty chair at the table, in the quiet of the mornings, and in the weight in my chest that would not lift. The reality of loss settled over me like a fog. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I would wait, that perhaps he would return. I called his name in my mind at night, hoping that one day it would answer back. But the days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months. The silence remained. That silence became part of the reality I lived in. I could not change it. I could not call it away. It was the truth I had to carry. Neighbors began to notice my quiet. They saw me sitting by the window more often, staring without seeing. They noticed the way I no longer laughed as I once did. Some came to ask if I was all right. Others said nothing, perhaps out of respect, perhaps because they could not find words to fill the space that loss had created. Loss does not only take a person away, it changes how the world sees you and how you see yourself. I began to understand that loss is not something you recover from in full. You do not simply heal and return to the way you were before. Loss changes the shape of your life. It leaves a place inside you that can never be filled. I lived in that space every day. I lived with the knowledge that my son was gone. Not gone in distance alone, but gone in presence, gone in connection. Friends and relatives began to speak gently to me about moving on. They said things like, "You must let go," or "It's time to live again." But letting go was not something I could do. Letting go meant forgetting, and forgetting meant erasing him. I could not erase him. I could not remove from my heart all the years of his laughter, all the moments of his childhood, all the sacrifices I made for him. That would be more painful than carrying the loss itself. The reality of loss became part of my daily life. It touched every moment. When I walked through the house, I passed rooms filled with echoes of him. His clothes still hung in the closet. His books lay on shelves, untouched. His favorite chair sat empty. Every object became a reminder that he had chosen to leave without goodbye. The home felt different. It was quieter, colder, even though the walls and roof were the same. Loss had changed the air. I noticed my own silence more deeply. I spoke less. Not because I could not speak, but because words felt inadequate. Words could not explain what I carried. They could not explain the pain, the absence, the longing, or the quiet strength I had decided to hold. So I spoke less. I listened more to the silence. In that silence, I began to hear the truth of my loss. The truth that some things could not be returned, but some things could be kept. Loss taught me about value. I began to see clearly what mattered. Not possessions, not wealth, not pride, but the love that remains, even when the person is gone. I understood that loss does not only take away, it can also leave something behind, a deeper understanding of what was shared, a deeper respect for the moments you had, a deeper love for what cannot be replaced. As the days passed, I realized that my grief had turned into a quiet kind of strength. It was not the strength of forgetting, but the strength of remembering. I could carry the reality of loss because I carried him in my heart. That became my way of living, my way of facing each day, my way of saying, even without him, he still mattered. Even without goodbye, he still lived in me. I began to speak about loss quietly to those who would listen, not to complain, not to demand answers, but to share the truth of what it was like to lose without warning, to lose without explanation, to lose without closure. And I found that others understood. They told me of their own losses. They nodded quietly. Loss was something universal. It was part of being human. It was part of loving. In my silence, I began to speak in other ways. I spoke through my actions. I treated those who remained with more care. I gave more freely of my time, my attention, my heart. Loss had taught me that moments are precious, that time is short, that saying goodbye, whether spoken or unspoken, is never truly the end of love. The reality of loss also taught me forgiveness. Forgiveness for him, for leaving without goodbye. Forgiveness for myself, for not being able to bring him back. Forgiveness for the life we could not finish together. I learned that forgiveness is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of peace. Forgiveness became part of the way I carried my loss. I began to see the absence of my son not as emptiness alone, but as a place where memory could live, where love could live, where a promise could live. A promise that I would hold his place in my heart forever. That even if he would not speak to me, I would speak to him in my silence. That even if he would not return, I would keep him close. Loss became a teacher. It taught me patience, humility, and the depth of quiet endurance. It taught me that some wounds never heal fully, and that some goodbyes never come. But it also taught me that love does not end with loss. Love becomes a part of your life that loss cannot take away. I began to write about my loss in a small journal, not for anyone else to read, but for myself. A place where I could pour out what I could not say aloud. A place where my grief could take shape. Writing became a way of living with my loss. A way of carrying it without letting it break me. Through writing, I came to understand that loss was not just about what I had lost, but also about what I had gained. I had gained the clarity of knowing what truly matters. I had gained the strength to let go without forgetting. I had gained the peace of knowing that my son had a place in my heart forever, even if he was no longer beside me. I began to treat loss as part of my life's story, not the end of it. I began to see that my life continued, shaped by loss but not defeated by it. That in carrying loss, I was carrying a form of love that would last beyond words, beyond time, beyond presence. Neighbors still asked me how I was. Friends still suggested I move on. But I knew that moving on was not the goal. The goal was to live with loss in a way that honored what had been. To live with loss in a way that kept the memory alive. I chose to live with loss as my silent companion. Loss changed me. It made me quieter, slower, more thoughtful. It made me treasure the present and the people who remained. It made me understand that some goodbyes are permanent, and some places in the heart remain forever. I knew I could not replace what was gone, but I could keep it. I could carry it with me every day of my life. The reality of loss is not in the ending alone, but in the living that follows. It is in how you carry what is gone. It is in how you let absence teach you. It is in how you let memory speak. I chose to carry my son in that way. Loss became my life's truth, a truth that I carry still, that my son left without goodbye, but I kept his place in my heart forever. That is the reality of my loss. The silence that came after loss was not empty. It was full of questions, memories, and quiet thoughts that no one could hear except me. I realized that living with loss meant finding a way to live with those questions. They were not questions that could be answered, but questions that shaped the way I lived. In the deep stillness of my days, I made a promise to myself, a promise that became the foundation of how I faced life after my son left without goodbye. That promise was simple, but powerful. I promised to keep my son's place in my heart forever. It was a vow made quietly, without speaking aloud, but with all the weight of my heart. It was a promise I made not for him, but for myself. For in keeping that place for him, I kept my own peace. I kept a part of our story alive. I kept the connection that loss tried to erase. To make that promise real, I began to live differently. I began to carry his memory with me in every step I took. When I walked in the mornings, I thought of him and the days we had shared. When I sat quietly in my home, I thought of his laughter and the times he would run to me with joy. These thoughts became a quiet prayer, not for him to return, but for me to keep the memory alive. Making a promise in the face of loss is not easy. Loss changes your heart. It changes the way you see the world. Some days, my heart felt heavy with sorrow. On other days, it felt full of love and remembrance. But the promise I made was my anchor. It kept me from losing myself to the pain. It gave me a way to move forward without forgetting. The promise was not just about keeping a memory. It was about living in a way that honored what had been. I began to treat each day as a chance to respect that promise. I spoke less of my pain to others, and instead spoke more to myself through my actions. I took care of myself. I cared for the home we once shared. I held on to the things that connected me to him, photographs, letters, small objects that carried memories. The promise also shaped my inner world. I began to see my son not just as a person who had left me, but as a part of my life that would always remain. I carried him in my heart in a way that was quiet but powerful. That place I held for him was not a place of waiting for return, but a place of remembering and accepting. I learned that love does not disappear with absence. Love changes shape, but it does not vanish. I began to think deeply about what it meant to keep someone in your heart forever. It meant choosing memory over forgetting, choosing love over bitterness, choosing peace over anger. It meant letting go of the need for explanations or closure. It meant holding on to something even when there was nothing left to hold on to except the promise itself. That inner promise became part of my identity. It was part of how I understood myself as a father and as a man. It was a quiet truth that shaped the way I lived each day. I did not speak of it to many because it was a private vow, but it was strong. Strong enough to carry me through the nights when my loneliness felt deepest. Strong enough to give me courage when I felt broken. I began to see that promises made to ourselves are often the hardest to keep. There is no one to hold you accountable except your own heart. There is no reward except the quiet satisfaction of keeping faith. I kept my promise because I had chosen to. I kept it because it mattered more than anything else in my life. Carrying that promise was not without pain. Some days it hurt to remember him. Some nights, tears would come unbidden. But I learned that those tears were not a sign of weakness. They were a sign that the promise was alive. They were proof that my son still had a place in my heart, that even without goodbye, even without explanation, I could hold on to him. In keeping that promise, I began to heal in a way I had not expected. Healing did not mean forgetting. Healing meant accepting the loss and living with it. Healing meant carrying the memory without allowing it to destroy the life I still had. It meant finding peace in the place I had made for him in my heart. The promise became a kind of shield. It protected me from the bitterness that can grow in the absence of closure. It protected me from the anger that could have consumed me. It gave me a quiet strength that carried me forward. That strength was not loud. It did not need to be shown to others. It lived in my heart, quietly and deeply. I began to see the promise as part of the gift of loss. Loss, though painful, had taught me something precious. It had taught me the value of memory. It had taught me the importance of keeping love alive, even when the person is gone. It had taught me that the heart can hold more than presence alone. The heart can hold absence and still be full. I thought often about what it meant to live with such a promise. It meant that every choice I made was shaped by that vow. It meant that I carried my son with me in every moment of my life. It meant that even in the quietest hours, when no one was near, I was speaking to him in my heart. It meant that I was living in honor of what we had shared. The promise changed the way I saw my own life. It made me more patient, more careful, more aware of the fragile nature of connection. I began to treasure each day, each breath, each moment of peace. I began to treat my life as something precious because I knew how quickly it could change. I also began to see my son differently, not as the one who left, but as the one who had been part of my life and who would always be part of my story. That shift was not easy. It took years of quiet reflection to arrive there. But when I did, I felt a peace I had not known before. Keeping my promise became an act of love and forgiveness. Love for the son who had gone without goodbye. Forgiveness for the hurt he caused by leaving. Forgiveness for my own pain. That forgiveness did not erase the loss, but it softened it. It turned loss into a quiet strength. Over time, I found that the promise gave me a deeper understanding of life. It taught me that goodbyes are not always spoken, that absence does not mean the end of love, that a place in the heart can remain forever, even when the person is no longer there. I began to live with that promise every day. It shaped my actions, my thoughts, and my heart. I carried it quietly, without telling many people. It was my own truth, my own gift to myself, a way to turn loss into something that could be lived with, rather than something that destroyed me. I thought often about how easy it would have been to let go, to forget, to move on without looking back. But I could not. I chose instead to hold on to him, to keep his place in my heart forever. That choice became my way of living after loss. The promise became a light in my life, a quiet light that guided me through the darkness of absence, a light that reminded me that love does not disappear, that memory does not fade, that a place in the heart can remain forever. And so I lived with my promise. I lived with it in my silence. I lived with it in my solitude. I lived with it in my heart. And in doing so, I found peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of keeping. Keeping him, keeping the memory, keeping the place he held in my heart forever. Loss remains with me. Silence remains with me. But so does my promise. It is my way of honoring him, my way of living beyond goodbye, my way of saying that even in leaving without a word, he still mattered, and I still matter too. That is the inner promise I made. That is the truth I live by. That is how I keep my son's place in my heart forever. Strength does not always come with noise. Sometimes strength comes quietly, without announcement, without ceremony. Strength lives in the small choices we make every day, in the ways we stand after we have been broken. For me, strength came after the deepest loss of my life, when my son left without goodbye. I had a choice in that moment, to let grief destroy me or to let it teach me a new way to live. I chose strength. Strength began as a decision. I decided that I would not let my life collapse under the weight of sorrow. I decided that I would carry the pain without letting it define me. I decided that I would live fully, even with an absence so deep it could hollow a man. That decision became the first step of strength. Strength is a choice, not something given. It is something made in the heart of hardship. When my son left, my world grew silent in ways I had never known. The home we shared felt emptier. The air felt heavier. The moments that once carried laughter now carried a quiet ache. But strength is found in facing silence without breaking. I began to walk through my days carrying my grief quietly, but carrying it with dignity. That quiet carrying was strength. Strength is not the absence of pain. Strength is the presence of courage in pain. I learned that lesson slowly. Every morning, I woke to the reality of his absence, Every night, I lay with the memory of his leaving, and each day I chose to rise, I chose to walk, I chose to live with an open heart. That was strength. It was not easy. There were days when grief felt too heavy to bear. There were mornings when I wanted to give up entirely, to let my body and spirit sink into the silence. But something inside me would not allow that. That something was strength. It was the quiet voice in my heart saying, "You can walk forward. You can live." That voice became my anchor. I found strength in routine. I found it in the small acts of daily life. I rose each morning, no matter how heavy the night had been. I tended to my home with care, not because it was easy, but because it was a choice to keep living. I ate, I walked, I spoke to friends, I kept my life moving. In those small acts, strength was born. Strength is in persistence, in choosing to move forward when moving forward feels impossible. Strength also came from my inner promise, the promise to keep my son's place in my heart forever. That promise gave me courage. It gave me a purpose beyond the pain. It gave me something to hold on to in the quiet hours. Strength grows when there is something to hold on to, and my promise was that anchor. Over time, strength changed me. I learned patience. I learned self-respect. I learned that living with absence does not mean living without love. My strength became rooted in forgiveness. Forgiveness for my son. Forgiveness for myself. I forgave him for leaving without goodbye. I forgave myself for feeling the pain so deeply. Forgiveness was a pillar of my strength. Strength is not shown in loud declarations. It is shown in quiet living. I began to live with my strength in silence. I did not speak of my pain to many because strength does not always need an audience. It is a quiet fire that burns within. I carried that fire in my steps, in my choices, in my heart. Strength is a quiet presence that lives within you even when no one else sees it. I also learned that strength grows from acceptance. I accepted that my son had made his choice. I accepted that I could not change the past. I accepted that goodbyes do not always come with words. That acceptance was not surrender. It was strength. Acceptance allowed me to let go of bitterness. It allowed me to open my heart to peace. Strength gave me the ability to stand in my own dignity. I did not shout or demand answers. I did not chase apologies. I simply stood still in my truth. My truth was that I had loved deeply, sacrificed fully, and kept my son's place in my heart forever. Standing in that truth was the quietest form of strength I could know. There were moments when my strength was tested, when I saw reminders of him everywhere, when I heard his name spoken, when I felt the weight of what had been lost. In those moments, strength was not to forget the pain, but to bear it without letting it break me. Strength is in carrying pain without letting it destroy the soul. My strength was also in finding joy again. I found joy in small things, the warmth of sunlight, the sound of birds in the morning, the laughter of children nearby. Those moments became my medicine. Strength is in allowing yourself to feel joy even after deep loss. It is in saying, "I will live and I will carry love with me." Strength is not always visible. People may not notice it in your quiet days. But strength is in the way you keep walking. It is in the way you keep living, even when your heart feels heavy. It is in the choice to keep your own place in your heart, even after goodbye. That is the strength I chose. I began to understand that strength was not just for me. It was for the people who loved me. It was for the example I left behind. Strength became my gift to those who watched me live after loss. It was my way of teaching that grief can be met with dignity, that absence can be met with peace, that love can be kept without holding on to what is gone. Over time, my strength became a part of who I was. It was not something I had to think about each day. It lived in my habits, my thoughts, my heart. Strength became part of my life as naturally as breathing. It became my quiet answer to the question of how to live after loss. I learned that strength is not a one-time act. It is a continuous choice. Every day I chose strength. Every day I chose to keep my promise. Every day I chose to live with dignity. That is the essence of strength. It is a daily decision to keep going, even when the path is hard. Strength gave me peace. Not a loud, obvious peace, but a quiet peace that came from knowing I had lived with my heart open. I had faced loss without giving up. I had kept my son's place in my heart forever. And that was enough. Now, as an old man, I see strength in the smallest details of life, in the calm of my mornings, in the quiet of my evenings, in the steady beat of my heart. Strength is not a show of force. It is the quiet voice that says, I will live and I will remember. My strength is my silence. My strength is my promise. My strength is my choice to carry love even when there is no answer. My strength is the way I stand, even after goodbye. That is the strength I have lived with. That is the strength I hold now. That is the strength I will carry until my last breath. Strength is not given. It is built. It is built in the face of pain. It is built in the choice to rise again. My strength was built in the silence after my son left without goodbye. My strength was built in the promise I made to myself. My strength was built in keeping his place in my heart forever. And in that strength, I found peace. Now, as an old man, I look back at my life with quiet eyes and a steady heart. I see the years not in numbers, but in moments. Moments of joy, moments of loss, moments of silence, and moments of strength. My story is not about bitterness or revenge. It is about understanding. It is about carrying a truth that was born out of heartbreak and shaped by years of reflection. Now I tell my story so that others might understand what I learned about love, loss, silence, and the quiet power of keeping a place in your heart forever. When my son left me without goodbye, I was filled with questions that had no answers. I asked myself why. I asked if I had failed him. I asked if love was not enough to keep him by my side. Those questions lived with me for many years. But in my reflection, I learned that sometimes there is no answer that will heal the wound. And that is part of life's lesson. Some questions must remain unanswered, and some wounds must be carried as part of who we are. Reflection taught me that my pain was not the end of my story. My pain became a teacher. It taught me about patience. It taught me about dignity. It taught me about the power of silence. I learned that silence is not emptiness. Silence can be a powerful answer when words are no longer heard. I learned that keeping love in your heart does not mean holding on to what is gone. It means allowing that love to live quietly, without demand, without condition. I thought a lot about what it means to be a father. Being a father is more than giving life. It is about giving love, guidance, sacrifice, and care without expectation. I gave all of that to my son. I gave him my years, my work, my dreams. I gave him my heart. And when he left without goodbye, I realized that my role as a father was not defined by his presence, but by the love I still carried for him. That became my reflection. A father's love is not erased by absence. I also reflected on the meaning of legacy. For many years, I thought my legacy would be in the things I built, the land I owned, the wealth I passed on. But my reflection taught me something deeper. My true legacy is not the possessions I leave, but the values I carry and pass on through example. My legacy became the strength I found in silence, the choice to love without condition, the decision to keep my son's place in my heart forever. That is the legacy I hold now. In my reflection, I thought about forgiveness. Forgiveness was not easy. For a long time, I carried bitterness in my heart. I carried the pain of unanswered goodbyes and broken promises. But with time, reflection brought understanding. I realized forgiveness was not about excusing what was done. Forgiveness was about freeing my own heart from being bound to that pain. Forgiveness became a part of my strength. Forgiveness became a gift I gave to myself. I thought about the lessons my life could teach others. I understood that my story is not just mine. It is a story of love, of loss, and of quiet strength that belongs to every person who has faced absence and betrayal. I want people to understand that leaving does not erase love, that silence can be answered with dignity, that keeping a place in your heart is a choice that brings peace. These are the lessons I learned in my reflection. Reflection also taught me about the nature of grief. Grief is not something to overcome quickly. It is not something that disappears with time. Grief is a quiet companion that lives alongside you. It changes shape, but it does not disappear. I learned to live with my grief. I learned to accept it as part of my life. That acceptance became another form of strength. I reflected on the gift of memory. My memories of my son are not all pain. They are filled with joy, laughter, lessons, and love. Keeping his place in my heart forever is not just about remembering his absence. It is about remembering our life together. My memories became a source of comfort. They became a way to carry him without needing him to be present. Memory is a quiet strength that keeps love alive. I also reflected on the power of letting go. Letting go is not forgetting. Letting go is accepting reality without losing the value of what was. I let go of anger. I let go of the need for explanation. I let go of the hope for a goodbye that never came. Letting go was not weakness. It was the quietest strength I could find. It was the choice to live without being held prisoner by the past. Reflection brought me peace. Not the loud peace of victory or triumph, but the quiet peace that comes from understanding your own journey. I found peace in knowing that I had lived with my heart open, that I had given love fully, and that I had kept my promise to myself. My peace comes from the strength of knowing I carried my son in my heart forever. Now, as an old man, I speak about my life without bitterness. I speak about it with calm and pride. I have learned that life is not measured in goodbyes or answers, but in the depth of love and the choices we make in response to loss. My life is my answer. My life is my strength. My life is my reflection. If I could speak to the young, I would say, learn to carry your heart with care. Learn to speak your truth quietly. Learn that strength is built in the moments you choose to rise after falling. Learn that leaving does not erase love, and silence can speak more powerfully than words. Learn that keeping a place in your heart forever is the truest way to love. I have learned that my story does not end in goodbye. My story continues in every heartbeat that carries my memory. My story continues in the quiet strength I hold. My story continues in the love that never fades. That is my reflection. That is my life's answer. My final thought is this. He left without a word, without goodbye, without looking back. But I kept his place in my heart forever. That is my strength. That is my choice. That is my legacy. And that is what I leave behind. A quiet example of love that lasts beyond absence. Now, in the stillness of my days, I find myself smiling quietly. Not because the pain is gone, but because I have learned to live with it. Not because I have forgotten, but because I have chosen to keep. I keep my son's place in my heart. I keep my love without condition. I keep my life with strength. That is my reflection. That is my truth. That is the story I share. And so, in my old age, I tell this story with calmness, knowing that my silence, my memory, and my choice will speak long after I am gone. He left without goodbye. I kept his place in my heart forever.